and welcome to the Good Health Podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Good, a registered nutritional therapy practitioner and functional medicine practitioner. Join me as we explore thyroid, brain, and fatigue conditions with positivity. From Hashimoto's to multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue to adrenal dysfunction, I've got you covered. With expert advice and tips to help you take action now and inspiring real patient stories from successful individuals who refuse to let their health hold them back. Start your journey to good health today. And don't forget to come and join the conversation on Instagram at good_health. That's GOODE. Or visit my website at nicolegoodhealth.com to find out more. Welcome to today's episode of the Good Health Podcast. Today I'm welcoming my colleague and fellow functional medicine practitioner, Karen Preece Smith, onto the podcast. We are going to talk all things long COVID. Karen is a functional medicine practitioner and she specialises in complex digestive symptoms, long COVID and post-viral fatigue. Let's jump straight into the conversation. So welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Lovely to be here, Nicole.
Yeah, so we connected through obviously being in the industry, I think quite a few years ago now, wasn't it? It's been quite a while and we've sort of crossed paths sort of a few times, but how did you sort of get into this sort of world? What's your sort of story? Because I know yours is a little bit different because I've spoken to a few other practitioners and we've always sort of said, there's usually kind of their own health problems and things like that. But I know your story is just slightly different. So just tell us a little bit about how you sort of got into nutrition in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always been quite academic and I ended up becoming a sort of lifestyle and fashion journalist for a number of years. So I worked for a lot of big magazines, newspapers, and then I did an MA actually in the history and culture of fashion, which I quickly found out there wasn't a huge market fashionably for writing about that in women's magazines. But I think the thing that I always loved about journalism and still do is I like the story behind it. So I like the fact that you've got to dig around for the details. There's often, things that being the first to connect, join the dots and kind of put this story together. So that's what really attracted me to moving into something like nutrition, because it's all about really listening to people's journeys, hearing how these things came about, and often kind of solving the mystery of where did this thing come from.
Yeah, I actually had a client said to me the other day, it was a couple of weeks ago, she said to me, you're like a detective of health.
Yeah,
I really liked that. I was like, yeah, that is really what we do, isn't it? That's exactly as you've described it. It's that sort of digging in and finding like the root causes and getting to the bottom of the story and really finding out what's going on for a person.
Exactly. So I loved all that side of things. I still am a health journalist. I moved more into kind of health and lifestyle. But yeah, I started working for a number of clinics early in my career and started working for quite a well-known chronic fatigue, post-viral fatigue clinic for about 3 years based in central London. Now I work for an integrated team in functional medicine, specialises in oncology. I do more of the sort of histamine MCAS side of things, which is mast cell activation syndrome, and also work in digestive health. So I see clients for sort of SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, IBS, inflammatory bowel disease, and in my own practice I've moved more into the long COVID side, which is what we're focusing in on today.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to jump into today, is that sort of side of thing. I mean, it's interesting to hear all the different things that you work with, but like you said, today we're going to kind of have that conversation around long COVID because it's a huge conversation. And I was actually looking at some of we're always keeping, because obviously it's a very fluid area, it's moving all the time, there's more research coming out all the time, so obviously it's something that's evolving. I'm always sort of reading the research and keeping up on it because it's something that comes up in clinic a lot. So I was looking at some of the stats and I just kind of wanted to just read some of these out for the listeners because they're I found some UK ones. I mean, obviously a lot of the time when we're doing these things, USA we get a lot of stats for, but maybe less so for the UK. But these were UK. They were June 2022. So we're another sort of, over a year on, aren't we? But they're quite astounding figures. So they said that basically with like long COVID, there was like 2 million people who were struggling with long COVID at the point of June 2022. So it's quite a way after the pandemic.
Shocking, isn't it? Yeah, it's not enough.
Yeah, within the UK, and it's still on the rise. They said that 405,000 were suffering less than 12 weeks following infection. 1.4 million was still struggling more than 12 weeks after infection. 807,000 were then still struggling a year after infection, and 403,000 were still struggling 2 years after infection. And they said all the research showed, this was in the immunology journal. I'll link it below the episode if people want to have a read. But this was all variants of SARS-CoV, so all the different variants that have come up. But they found that Omicron actually was the one that was giving the most people long COVID.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, which is interesting. And they said based on that, there was roughly at this point, at June 2022, roughly 1.2 million individuals who still had long COVID a year, and they were all a year or two after sort of that initial infection. And I just thought that was really interesting as you're sort of looking up. I mean, that's a huge problem, isn't it?
Huge number. And I would say that I was really expecting, so I got into this area during the pandemic. And as you said, it's an evolving market, it's evolving diagnoses and sort of treatment protocols. And I was really fascinated by the research again, kind of getting into that health detective role. And what surprised me is that I'm still fully booked with a wait list 2 years on. And there's still more people coming to see me who have had long COVID for now sort of 2-3 years, that have gone through some, very well set up NHS long COVID clinics. Some have gone to Germany or the States to get some really good treatment protocols in place, but they're still suffering. I find that quite shocking. It's such a huge health epidemic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think, so the other thing, let's just clarify for people here that are listening. So when I talk long COVID, I'm often talking post-infection and also post the jab, because we know that there can be damage from that too. When you talk long COVID, are you just talking infection, or are you talking both as well?
I'm talking the same. Yeah, so exactly the same. But I'd say I think the official definition is 12 weeks post-infection. So when those earlier stats we talked about, there's a bit of discrepancy between within that 12 week and then post 12 weeks. So even 12 weeks one day is you're now talking the long COVID, or it used to be called in the United States long haul COVID for a while. So that, or kind of the more traditional post-viral fatigue or post-viral infection.
And this has been really interesting, I think, because chronic fatigue is something, I know we both worked with chronic fatigue over the years, but chronic fatigue is one of those things that there's really been very little done about it, very little in the grand scheme of, if we're looking at research for other illnesses, very little research into sort of chronic fatigue and things like that. And really there's, there is a crossover. They are both post-viral fatigue conditions, but this sort of COVID one actually for chronic fatigue people has actually been almost a bit of a blessing that the research is now being done into long COVID, isn't it?
And I think it's interesting you touched on that, because I think there was quite a lot of annoyance, if you like, within the sort of the ME post-viral fatigue and CFS, current clientele, because they've been suffering for years and there hasn't been much of an advancement in terms of protocols. It was only last year, I believe, that they threw out the idea of graduated exercise as not being effective. But that had been used for sort of 10, 15 years. So we've got 10, 15 years of people going through the system, not getting anywhere, having to seek external support, and then suddenly all this investment and time and energy and research into this new area. Obviously it helps them, but it's a little too late, I'd say.
Yeah. And you can understand that. You can understand their sort of frustration around, the fact that, because I think a lot of the time as well, they've not only not had the research, they've almost been, I know people who've had chronic fatigue who were sort of told it's in your head almost, and it's, it's not a real thing. And, there's been a lot of dismissal around it, hasn't there, over the years. And I think it's more accepted now, or certainly within our world, it's very accepted. But I think even in conventional medicine, it's sort of more accepted now. But they've been through a lot, haven't they, with their sort of story, and not getting answers, not getting believed, not getting understood. And hopefully this does change that for them. And like you said, bit little too late, but for a lot of people, but hopefully it is turning the tide and starting to get a little bit more research into these things.
And I think what's interesting as well is you've got a lot of doctors around COVID that there were no mechanisms of action at first of how does long COVID work. So everyone in every specialism was kind of looking into it. So you had some of the kind of front runners were people like Dr. Samuel Yannick from the United States, because I think his wife developed long COVID, and he was looking at it from a sort of immunological perspective. So you suddenly had that insight into it, which I think he was very groundbreaking, and I follow a lot of his sort of protocols today. And other people who are looking more at sort of like the bacterial load. So I know Debbie Cotton at Invivo did some wonderful work around the shifts in the gut microbiota for people who have COVID developing into long COVID. And then you've got Dr. Tina Peers and Emma over at Life Code GX who are looking at the histamine link and ESR2 receptors with long COVID. So lots of different areas of study that sort of pull it all together really to create those protocols.
Yeah, and it's what's needed. So if we sort of think, if people are sort of listening to this, let's sort of start, I guess, with how would they recognize long COVID? What are the symptoms of long COVID? What should they, because a lot, some of these things, not all of them, but some of these things are things that we can almost accept as normal. Yeah, exactly. So what sort of symptoms, if people are experiencing it, what should they be looking for and sort of saying, actually, there could be something going on and maybe I need some support?
Well, I would say my long COVID clients fall into two broad categories. So with men, it tends to be younger athletic men from 18 to 25, maybe 18 to 30, who are, type A, so very busy, love exercise, the type that are out for their 5 a.m. run, then lift weights, then full day at work, then, partying hard, those type of people. So they are category 1. And category 2 tends to be women, and most of my clients are women with long COVID who are more in the sort of perimenopause to menopausal age range. So maybe sort of late 30s, early 40s to 55, who often develop a sort of histamine MCAS style reaction at the same time, which we can get into. So it's very different presentation. But in terms of what brings the two groups together, I say breathlessness, long-term fatigue, a kind of disinterestedness. So for these very high achieving people, they're now no longer going for a promotion. They can't be bothered to get in a relationship or leave a relationship that's not going anywhere. They're off exercise. They're kind of quite low mood or anxious and almost looking for answers. They know something is not right, but they can't quite put their finger on what it is.
Yeah, I think that's the case for a lot of the people I see. That's what they've said. I think that's probably the overriding comment. And what the main comment I've seen from a lot of people is, I know something's not right. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I know something is not, it's not been right since COVID, but I'm not quite sure what's wrong. And I think that we hear that sort of a lot, I think, don't you, in clinic. What about you've mentioned the histamine and the MCAS, which I know you do a lot of work in. Tell us a little bit about that and sort of how that affects people and what they would be sort of looking for with that side of things.
So that side of things, again, it can happen for men, but it's more likely to happen with women from my sort of clients that I support. So Lucy, when you're going through a change in hormones, so sort of perimenopause, menopause, we're looking for, shift in hormones. And often, particularly around menopause, you've got estrogen goes up and progesterone can go down. So estrogen's going up mainly because progesterone is dropping, or maybe progesterone is a bit high and estrogen goes down, but there's some imbalances there. And there's a few things that can affect that, one of which is histamine. So if you've got poor gut health and certain strains of bacteria, or you've got parasites, let's say, you'll have higher histamine, which pushes your estrogen up. And if you're very stressed as well, as you probably are, if all that's going on, you've also got a higher estrogen tendency. So when we've got this strong estrogen, we get this strong histamine reaction with it, which is totally normal. However, it's quite inflammatory and it's a bit like a sort of a bucket. Like you can keep pouring in histamine to it and eventually it's just going to overflow. So you may have been fine in your 20s or 30s, and then it's just that shift of hormones that sends things going wrong. So you're going to start getting, along with all the menopausal symptoms, so breathlessness, hives, urticaria, redness, palpitations, these sort of things, and strong reactions to food. So I've got some clients with anaphylaxis, but it tends to be more sort of noticing your stomach just feels a bit off with certain foods, like maybe your avocado on toast you're not agreeing with, or you can't have spinach in a smoothie, or you can no longer take your own packed lunch to work because the chicken tastes a bit off because you're not making it from fresh. So these sort of changes.
And often it's healthy foods, isn't it? That's, I think people always assume that, if you're going to get reactions to foods and things like this, that generally it's going to be the unhealthy sort of foods. they don't necessarily always think that things like, like you've just mentioned, the spinach and things like that, they're sort of like, well, that's healthy food.
So I just had lunch and I had, obviously, I'm, specialise in gut health and everything. So I had avocado on toast with kimchi mushrooms, tomato, avocado and spinach. So it's like huge histamine.
Sounds lovely. Very high in histamine.
It's really nice.
Lovely.
But it was kind of a healthy gut lunch. So, and some kombucha on the side. So all that high fermented food, really, if you've got high histamine, it's not great because it's going to
people don't. Exactly. And then people don't always realize, and they think, the number of times people will come in and be like, no, I eat really healthy lunches. And they'll literally list off what you've just listed off. And it's that's how healthy I am, and I'm so healthy. This is what I'm eating for my lunch. And they just don't realize that actually that is really healthy. But if you've got this histamine problem, that actually that meal is not healthy for you at this time. That doesn't mean we can't deal with it and get you back to being able to
wrong time. And I think it's that as well. And often these women are going through menopause, so they may be gaining a bit of weight, which they don't like. So they might be upping the exercise and moving away from the yoga and the sensate and all these kind of restorative things into high intensity interval training, which is actually ironically going to raise histamine even more. So you've got this perfect storm of all these healthy activities which are pushing up histamine, causing that sort of hormonal imbalance, and then it really affects your immunity.
Yeah, it does. And as well as all of that is kind of on the, I guess, the symptoms sort of side of things. Histamine intolerance is kind of a little bit more of leaning towards a sort of a condition, but generally we're talking about a lot of symptoms there. But what about things that have you seen things? I know I have certain increases in conditions or diagnoses, diseases, in clinic. For me, obviously I work in autoimmunity, so I'm going to see a lot of those people anyway. But for me, it's been, COVID sort of either triggering autoimmunity in people that didn't have it before. They will have obviously had the genetics, things like that, but this was the environmental thing that sort of triggered it off, or flaring up of autoimmunity. Have you seen conditions as well as symptoms?
Yeah. And often we might get into it, but what's interesting if you run stool tests with long COVID clients is that often if you do a stool test in clinic, it's for your classic person who wakes up with diarrhea and has got bloating and undigested food in their stool, and kind of it comes back and it's not that surprising that there's a lot of work to be done. But if you were to run a stool test for a long COVID client, you typically see that there's not a lot there, which is really frustrating. So you might get one or two raised histamine or hydrogen sulfide strains of bacteria, but really what you're seeing is depleted gut lining, so low Akkermansia species, high Rumiococcus navis, these sort of mucin degrading species. We're seeing very low bacteroides, Bacteroides and Bifidobacterium, low lactobacillus, low of these kind of protective elements. So even though at first glance it's like, oh, everything's fine, everything is kind of suboptimal. So there's just not the immune response and the immune defense to really fight off infections, which is quite sad, really. So you're not necessarily seeing a big shift of digestive symptoms, but you're noticing that you're not getting over that cold, that cough. You can get a lot of viral reactivation. So your client who maybe had chronic fatigue when they were younger, or adrenal fatigue or burnout, they're getting those symptoms back again. So it's almost like it kind of turns the switch on anything bad that's happened health-wise in your past, which isn't helpful.
Yeah, I think that's sort of where it gets to. That I guess that's kind of the link with the autoimmune side of things, or it's one of the links. There's a few, I think they're finding a few mechanisms now with the autoimmunity, but we're seeing specifically sort of skin related autoimmunities, so things like psoriasis, hair related, like you sort of alopecia, seeing a lot of that. Actually, I've been talking to a consultant dermatologist actually about this, and he's seeing the same in his clinic. So he's seeing an awful lot more. He's actually seeing a lot more post the vaccine as well, a lot of as well as post
like the hair shedding
lots of it. He's seeing it post COVID as well, but also a lot of it post vaccine, and he's inundated, he said, with alopecia cases, general hair shedding, even if they've don't get to the point of being diagnosed with alopecia, but that sort of general hair loss, and psoriasis as well. He's getting a lot of that. I'm also seeing a lot of thyroid autoimmunity being triggered. Yeah. lots of Hashimoto's. I work with a lot of Hashimoto's, so I see Hashimoto's multiple times every day anyway, but I'm seeing a lot more of it that's been triggered, post-infection. We can see they didn't have it before and they've kind of got it now. And the other one is neurological autoimmunity as well, seeing a big increase in that too. So it seems to be kind of that skin, thyroid, and thyroid probably again linked with that hormones that you were sort of talking about. But
and the adrenal axis, HPA going off. I'd say with the cognitive side, brain fog is a big one.
Yeah.
I've got a lovely client I'm working with at the moment, still working with, who PhD student, and was just finding that cognitive recall and everything wasn't there. But part of that is because we know there's an effect with long COVID and melatonin suppression. So long COVID suppresses melatonin, which is the hormone we need to sleep. So as we know from the work of Dr. Matthew Walker, we've got that window between midnight and 2 a.m. where we effectively shift memories from short to long-term storage. So if that's not taking place every night because there's not enough melatonin, you're waking up, not only is it pushing that HPA axis and the stress response, but you can't remember what you did the day before. So those nice positive memories aren't there, and the get food for the cat, pay this bill also isn't there. So you're left feeling quite anxious and irritable, which, doesn't help when you've got these other symptoms.
Yeah. And you mentioned, if we sort of look at some of these mechanisms and the reasons behind it, because they are, like we've said, it is a very evolving area, but more and more of it is kind of coming out over time. And you mentioned that kind of viral persistence, I guess, and also that reactivation of those latent viruses. So we know that, the Epstein-Barr, the HHV6, things like that, we're seeing a lot. I'm seeing quite a bit of CMV as well, people that have had that before, that's being reactivated. But just tell us sort of a bit more about that, about the sort of the viral kind of side of those mechanisms.
So if you have a chronic virus, you're going to get mild inflammation in the body. So you could test that by doing something like increases in CRP protein, let's say. If you've got mild inflammation throughout the body, it affects your sleep. So your sleep diminishes, your REM sleep increases, strangely, and that puts stress on the body. So that then natural process, you create more IL-6 and TNF. That increases inflammation, and the inflammation increases further. It can lead to things like breathing difficulties, heart palpitations, and even pneumonia. So you can see where just one small thing starts affecting other things. You get bigger and bigger symptoms as you go through.
Yeah, it's like a chain effect, isn't it? Of everything sort of builds on others. And I think people think as well, once you're over the virus, that you've got the virus, even if we're not talking about the sort of reactivation of the latent viruses, but actually just the COVID virus itself, that, they sort of think, I have the virus, and, maybe 10 days later, 5 days later, whatever it might be, they're feeling better. They sort of think that's it. Virus is, it's gone. But actually, it's not. That virus can linger in your gut, in your brain, in your muscles, so there's lots of places,
like you said. Yeah. And I think the problem as well is the type of people who are getting long COVID are the people who were the ex-athletes, the kind of go-getters. They don't really want to take a whole week off work to rest and recuperate. They want to get straight back to it as soon as they feel ready, which, for most things is good. But for this, you really need to, if you're reactivating past viruses, you really need to take that additional bit of time to rest and recover and then get back to things.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that as well, it's, it's having, like you said, it's having that sort of impact on the gut in terms of that sort of, I want to say dysbiosis, but it doesn't necessarily, like you said, it doesn't necessarily come up, does it, as dysbiosis on test results? It kind of is okay. They're kind of healthy, like like you said, but it is causing these imbalances. I'm seeing, like you said, a lot of that sort of gut barrier stuff. And we know that's a huge trigger that, on social media, the leaky gut, we call it sort of that intestinal permeability or that gut barrier. But, we know that's a real, it's a real root cause underlying imbalance with autoimmune patients. It's a real problem. And they are seeing that, aren't they? They're seeing this kind of these, those unwanted molecules get through. We then get that inflammatory process going on. The immune system then has to come and mop that up. And it's that activation of the immune system, which you would think a lot of people sort of say, well, isn't that like a good thing? Like my immune system's
it's that whole
working.
thing, your immunity, isn't it? Yeah. So you've loosely you've got these, it's not exactly as simple as this, but you've got these two strains of your immune system. So you've got one called Th1 and you've got one called Th2. So what we really want to see is the Th1 is like your fighter response. So if you were to catch COVID, you want Th1 to be nicely activated. So, get all those cytokines out there, the NK cells, fight the infection, control the temperature, etc. And then in a healthy individual, that would start to just regulate. But what we're seeing in long COVID is that Th1 response goes on, and the body doesn't switch into Th2, which is kind of like the, put your firing arms down and just relax, which is interesting because we have that backup system, because as women, when we're pregnant, we don't want our bodies to abort the fetus. So we want this to go into this Th2 response. So it's got a sort of ancestral need to have this response. But without it pushing into Th2, the virus just goes on and on. So from that sort of molecular cellular level, the body still thinks it's fighting the infection when it's long gone. So you've got this increased inflammation, you've got increased NK cells, increased IL-6 inhibitors, and it's not a positive place to be.
Yeah. And of course, with those sort of autoimmune diseases that we're seeing triggered a lot, you can be either, depending on the autoimmune disease you've got, you can be either Th1 dominant or Th2 dominant. So, it depends on which way that falls as well. It will have an impact.
Yeah. So that's a hard one, because as far as I'm aware, you can't really test for, well, there's a few tests you can do for Th1, Th2 dominance, but they're not that great. So I tend to go more on what the client says, are you feeling very stressed? Have you got a very accelerated heart rate? Do you wake up at 1 to 3 a.m., worried about the day and your own health? Or can you actually switch off and relax and enjoy a comedy with a partner or something? And those sort of markers, I think, are quite useful, because this can be slow progress for people. I've got a lot of clients that are bedbound still, having to have food deliveries, and can't do more than 3-4 minutes walking a day.
Yeah, I had a client who I've still got a client, I'm still working with her, but it came up when we tested, we did Cyrex Array 5 with her, because she was getting a lot of kind of those, those autoimmune symptoms that are like, they don't kind of fall into a box of an autoimmune disease, but we see that autoimmune picture. And she had that. So we did Array 5 to see what was going on. And actually, she just flagged up that she'd had COVID. She's actually a doctor and had worked on the front line in COVID. So definitely been exposed to it multiple times. And she basically flagged up to everything. She had that real polyreactive autoimmunity, picture going on. We then, based on that, we did viral testing, and she had reactivation of latent viruses. So she didn't have EBV, actually. She had HHV6, she had CMV. So she had those two, were both flaring up. She got gut dysbiosis that was flagging up. She had like her immune and inflammatory markers were also flagging up. So it's not always, we're talking about these different mechanisms, but it's not always one, it's not always that a person's going to have one of these mechanisms. It could be a mix.
Even if we have a small shift in our gut microbiota, let's say, so, everything depletes by 5-10%, you may then find that results in, constipation, which you used to be able to have regular bowel movements. And because you're constipated, you're going to build up more estrogen, histamine, all of these products, the detox, which can then lead to brain fog and all the rest of it. And then everything's moving slowly, more likely to get SIBO. So you can get these kind of comorbidities at the same time. And yeah, it's really unfortunate, because it's which fire do you fight first? And if you're feeling really low in energy, you don't want to start a really aggressive antimicrobial protocol, because often the client can't cope with that. So it's a tricky position to be in.
And that's where this detective work comes in a little bit, doesn't it? Finding what these different things are, and then
glass out.
And then deciding that route forwards. Yeah.
So I find, in terms of sort of dietary approaches, obviously it's got to be personalized to the client, but there's a few things that really help. So I quite like a low histamine diet for long COVID, for the reasons that can be really effective. Obviously it's not the solution, but it's whilst we work on clearing that. Yeah, short term. Or short term, something like biphasic, or the low FODMAP diet. So we're reducing lots of sugars and starch, or even keto can work quite well. And I tend to, just like the research with cancer into keto diets and low levels of L-glutamine, I tend to follow that with long COVID clients by not really giving L-glutamine for gut health. I do, the zinc, carnosine, vitamin A, these sort of things instead, just in case we don't know yet, but there might be that link there, and just to rule it out. But if there was one, obviously you can't give sort of generic supplement advice, but
no, of course.
If there was one that I'd say definitely worth speaking to your nutritional therapist about, I'd say it's glutathione. So something that's really antioxidant, really good for breaking down free radicals. I mean, I've got the GSTM1 gene absent, so I notice if I'm filling up my car with petrol, I can't face the petrol pump because the fumes are too much for me. So if you're someone like that as well, you'll have an increased need to detoxify. And that's where, cutting back on the caffeine, cutting back on the alcohol and the sugars, and spending more time trying to get in that nice rest and digest response, parasympathetic nervous system response, can really help, as well as all these other levels of things.
Yeah. And I know, like you said, we can't give, individual supplement advice out, but the, glutathione is that master antioxidant, isn't it? It's, I mean, there's other things, some people can be a little bit sensitive with it, and there's other things we can then give the precursors, can't we? But if a person can take the glutathione, if they can tolerate it, then there really is, there is no real better antioxidant.
I'd say that's the best one. And there's a lot of research on it. So I get lots of people who, obviously, if you're living this for a number of years, they're probably more informed than me in a way in terms of what's new out there. So there's a lot of talk at the moment around NADH for the cognitive benefits, or PEA, which, I've got a few clients with, or D-ribose. What else have I got other clients taking? I really like this natural anti-inflammatory approach. So, increase your oily fish, your dark green leafy veg, get your magnesium levels up, B vitamins, all those foundations, vitamin D, vitamin C, because without those there, you're kind of missing out on that's the baseline really. They're the big things to put in first.
And it's like anything, you've got to get those foundations in place, and then you can then dig into those, actually, what other mechanisms are going on now, what other root causes are there that we can then work on. And
superfoods, like I think beetroot's amazing because it's really high in nitric oxide, so that's a really good one to sort of detoxification, but it really depends on the client, I'd say. I like astragalus as well, and I think there's a few supplement companies that are starting to add that to gut health products, which I find quite interesting. So you can get, now there's a nice one by Pure Encapsulations, I think, which has got different layers of gut health promoting supplements with astragalus in, which is antiviral. Or you could go through the mycology approach. So mycology is really good. So mushrooms to reset the Th1, Th2 balance, something like cordyceps, reishi, all of these things. So there's definitely a few ways you can go, but it's really important to work with someone.
Yeah, it is. And what about the, if somebody does come and work with you, what about the sort of the testing side of things? So I know that, there's some things that we sort of said that we can't test for. I mean, so I've used the, is it Immunosciences Lab? I think the long COVID panel and the autoimmune panel as well.
Some doctors in the UK, so they were running a sort of CFS panel a few years ago, and those doctors who often have long COVID clinics, Scotland's great for long COVID clinics actually, will do a long COVID panel. So they'll test things on the NHS like your vitamin C, vitamin D3, thyroid antibodies, etc., which is really useful, white blood cells. I tend to start with a stool test, and like I said, usually not a lot comes back. I really like the in vivo GI ecologics because it's easy to pick out the strains that are connected to long COVID and histamine, but there's some other great ones out there. Often there's SIBO, so if I'm suspecting SIBO picture, high methane, high hydrogen, high histamine, then a SIBO test as well. Or even something, typical like a metabolomics or a NutriVal. So you're looking at where those nutrient deficiencies are. And again, putting your health detective hat on, thinking, okay, well, we know they're going to need an increased need for L-glycine because there's likely low glutathione. But, why is taurine on the floor? Or why is their vitamin D at 20 when they've been taking 4,000 IU for 2 years? So we're kind of asking questions behind that. And often it is things like the heavy metals, the mold toxicity, the viral comorbidities, all these things that we'd look at with CFS clients and autoimmune clients that are layered on as well. So you've got the long COVID and then you've got these additional things.
Yeah, my client that had the polyreactive autoimmunity and the reactivated viruses and the gut dysbiosis and all that, she had mold toxicity as well. Actually, that was the other one she had.
That's so tricky because do you deal with that first? With mold, I also see clients with mold, and I always say correct the environment first. So get pure maintenance in, fog the room, make sure that it's all clean, and then do the mold protocol. But again, you've got to be strong enough to do that mold protocol. So if you've got really low commensal bacteria and lots of co-infections, where do you start? It's a tricky one.
I'm seeing so much mold at the moment, actually. I don't know. I've debated whether it's because we've all got sort of low immunity, like our immune function has been through the, lockdowns and things like that, not necessarily because of long COVID, just because we've not mixed and we've not sort of caught things and all of that our immune systems are not quite as, sort of as robust as they maybe were before.
Hand washing as well, a dog, I'll walk her, but everyone's carrying around these little alcoholic hand sanitizers and it's all of,
and you do wonder, don't you? Wonder whether that's had because I'm inundated with mold at the moment. It's in just so many clients that have got that as an underlying I wonder
if it's because we're looking for it more, because
maybe
we know that there's similar symptoms, isn't it? It's brain fog, it's joint pain, it's stomach upset, but not that core thing of it happens with these foods, or it happens in this situation.
Although I used to get some where we would test and it would come back negative, and I haven't had a negative mold test in clinic,
isn't it?
And I'm talking probably this year. I don't think I've had a negative mold test.
Octatoxin A that comes up, or different ones?
It's a lot of octatoxin A and citrulline are the two that have come up predominantly, and a few others that have come up sort of for various reasons. Sometimes we know why those have sort of come up, but octatoxin A massively. I'd say as well, I mean, we've got to be careful what we say, because we can't really comment on the vaccines as nutritional therapists. But one client did bring up the fact that she knew she had histamine intolerance because she had a rare form of blood cancer. So she'd had that diagnosed at the same time. And she refused one type of the vaccine because it was known to increase histamine intolerance. And it's a very well-known British-made vaccine. So it's interesting that came up because she obviously was very knowledgeable, had researched this in advance, and chose not to have her booster at a particular time so she could have a different vaccine. And, there will be an appropriate vaccine for you if you choose to vaccinate. But interesting, of course, I've got young children, they weren't vaccinated because they were not of the age. So we've got these new generation coming through unvaccinated but exposed, and we've got people who are semi-vaccinated, some who have had boosters, some who have not. They're all different types. And how does that all relate to one another and have an impact? I was talking to somebody yesterday who, within her family, she'd got her sister had 7 vaccines, immunocompromised, had 7, and she'd had I think 3. And then her children had 1 and then decided not to have any more. And, and older children, not children, but within the family, it was interesting how people had taken different, just different stances and different opinions and gone down different roads with it. And, they were sort of all over the place. And it is interesting how that's going to impact.
Well, it's a personal choice. And, I wasn't particularly pro-vaccination, just through reading the research. I did decide to get it done myself because I live with a teacher and I've got children, and I just thought, for them, I'd like to do it. And then last year I had appendicitis, so I had a booster, which I don't think I'm entitled to this year. So I've ended up having 4, but all different types of vaccine. So I'm not sure how they all interrelate. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I had it, but I had one, but I was very ill after it, so I didn't have any more. I could have done. We were willing to give me more, but it was such a bad experience. I was like, no, thank you. I don't think I want to go through it again. But it's different for everybody. I mean, I developed psoriasis after one of them. I didn't have that before.
And it's that autoimmune response, isn't it? Again.
Yeah, but I did have autoimmunity, and the psoriasis is gone now, and I've dealt with it and sorted it out. But that was that underlying autoimmune just didn't react well with having it.
And I think also there was such a rush to get the vaccines when they came out, that I know a lot of people were kind of coughing and sneezing in the queue. Now, if you get a vaccine when you're coughing and sneezing and your immunity is low, it doesn't take as well. So it's, We talk about bioavailability of vitamins, minerals, our soil, all of these different things. And it's, if you're taking a vaccine, you're expecting full coverage and you get 50%. It's interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more coming out about it over the years to come, I'm sure. But yeah, so what, for people, that are sort of, that have listened to the conversation and, sort of thought, that might be me, or they know they're struggling with it, what would be your, what's your sort of top 3 tips to people? I know you've mentioned some of the sort of, supplements and food and things like that, but if they just want to take 3 steps that they could kind of go and do today, if they feel like this is something that is an ongoing problem for them, what would you recommend?
Okay, so I'd say if you're someone who suspects on COVID in yourself, no harm in following a low histamine diet for 2 weeks. I can send you one that you can attach to the show notes, but basically just look at your diet, cut out the avocado, the tomato, the spinach, the processed meats. Make sure you're cooking everything from scratch, no alcohol, no fermented foods. All those foods that you've been eating for good gut health, you might need to rethink for 14 days. If you feel a sudden, everything feels better, that's when you should book in with someone to get further support with this, because we don't want to be on that long term. Secondly, I would say, really set a good wake sleep schedule. So we know there's that definite impact with melatonin across all age groups. So you may wish to have a conversation with your doctor or private doctor about a melatonin prescription, but there's things you can do as well at home. So make sure when you go to bed that the room's dark, that you're in a happy place. If you are very stressed, keep a notebook next to your bed and just write down some things. Keep the room slightly cool, listen to some like relaxing music, warm bath before bed, blackout blinds, all these sort of sleep hygiene things, if you like. And then in the morning, get out into the sunlight as soon as you can. Have your tea in the garden, sunlight on your face. So that's 1 and 2. And the third one, I'd say, work on your stress response, because you could see, me or Nicole or another functional medicine practitioner who can put a really complex plan in place and all the testing and everything. But if you're sat at home really stressed and thinking, I don't know what's going on and I can't relax, and you're on that sort of fight or flight pathway, you're just pushing that Th1 response, that inflammatory pathway. So we want to trick our bodies out of that. So a simple one is breathing. So inhale for a count of 3, hold your breath comfortably for 4 counts, exhale for a count of 4. And just whenever you catch yourself, do that a few times in the day. Or, I'm a big fan of Sensate, the device you stick on your chest. It vibrates, stimulates your vagal nerve. If you don't want to buy a Sensate, you can do that through humming, singing, gargling. In Scotland, they've even started long COVID choirs, which I think is amazing. So all of these things that you can stimulate that part of your body. And then find something you love to do. So if you are feeling really low mood, low energy, etc. with long COVID, you may not want to do much, but you could stick some comedy on rather than a sort of, like the Jimmy Savile documentary or something a bit hard hitting, some lightness, some, old Friends episodes, whatever you like watching.
That's what it always is for me. It's my go-to.
Yeah, Friends, exactly. Or, Schitt's Creek, I love that as well. Or stroke your cat, stroke your dog, hug your partner, your friend, your, children. So you're creating more of that positive reinforcement in your life. And I'd say even with those 3 changes, you'll start to feel a bit better. And that's the stage that you could then look into getting further help, just to accelerate that journey back to wellness.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice and some lovely tips there for people to go away with. Karen, thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation. I think it's really important to just to get the word out there, I think, for people with long COVID, and let them know that there is actually help and support and people who understand it out there that can really guide them in the next steps. And that there is, I've always said with this podcast, the key is we want to talk about these things, and we're talking about, some conditions that are quite serious and they're chronic and things like that, but that we want to do it with positivity and show people that actually there is a positive message. Yeah, exactly. Because I think, there's so much of the negative out there. You can Google anything. I was talking about Dr. Google as well yesterday, and how much of the negative there is on that and things like that. And I think, if we can get a positive message on this, talk about the downsides and the symptoms and the bad things and stuff like that, but also have a positive spin on it. And I think that's definitely what you've done with this today, which is nice. And that's what we want to get out there for people. So we will link we'll put all your links below to your Instagram, to your website. And yeah, if you've got that link to the histamine information, link that below as well for people. So yeah, definitely head down into the show notes if you want to get those links, and follow Karen on Instagram, and yeah, jump into DMs and say hi and
say hi. Play your tale with me. Wonderful to speak to you today, Nicole, and thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Good Health Podcast. Do share the episode with anyone who you think it may benefit or who may enjoy it, and help me spread the word by rating the episode or leaving a review. If you want more, you can find other episodes in the series on your podcast app, or sign up to my free newsletter. Not only will you get information on new episodes launching, but we cover lots of health topics, with the Ask Nicole section where you can send in your questions, my favourite recipes, my favourite products, tips and tricks to help you on the road to good health, and much more. You can sign up free of charge at nicolegoodhealth.com/newsletter, also linked below. I hope you have a lovely week. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.